Considering the state of world affairs, it's hard to imagine an Israeli Jew serving as Prime Minister of Iran. It would be sort of like an American Southern Baptist minister being installed in Beijing to head up the government of Communist China. Such a thing would be unheard of. But there actually was an Israeli Jew who did serve for years as Prime Minister of Iran. And how he got into that high position is an account involving attempted murder and attempted genocide, a story that sheds light on events in the modern world as well. If you Google a list of Iran's prime ministers, you won't find the Jewish leader's photograph there. That's because photography had not yet been invented when he served in that capacity. It was somewhere around 2,500 years ago when the man referred to in history as Mordecai the Jew served in that high position in the government of Iran. And that history is recorded in the Bible, in the Old Testament book of Esther. Casual modern readers might not recognize that Iran is being spoken of unless they're aware that Iran has also been called by the name Persia down through history. So it might not have occurred to you that the expensive, genuine Persian rug on your living room floor was handcrafted in modern-day Iran, the land of the Ayatollahs who lead crowds in chants of death to Israel and death to America. Persia and Iran are both ancient names used for thousands of years to describe the same nation. Persia was the name the Greeks used to describe that land long before the region was conquered by Alexander the Great. And Iran was the name more commonly used by the local people themselves. Ancient Bible manuscripts written in Hebrew and Greek use the name Persia to describe that great empire, where Mordecai the Jew served as prime minister. The final chapter of the Old Testament book of Esther says, "His great achievements and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai the Jew became the prime minister with authority next to that of King Xerxes himself." Yes, it says Mordecai the Jew became the prime minister with authority next to that of King Xerxes himself. Which king was that? The Hebrew name, the Hebrew word used there is Ahasuerus, and many Bible translations use that name in English, Ahasuerus. There were several Persian kings with similar names, Xerxes the first and Xerxes the second, and 5 kings named Artaxerxes, and they all reigned during a 150-year period from about 486 BC to 329 BC. So it's not completely clear which one is meant by the name Ahasuerus in the book of Esther. Ahasuerus reigned at a time when there were many Jews in Persia, and when the Persian Empire stretched from Ethiopia to India across some 3,000 miles, similar to the distance across the continental United States. It included the Middle East, where the Promised Land is found. So practically all of the world's Jewish people lived within the territory of the Persian Empire. And many of those Jews lived in and around Iran itself. Why were there so many Jews in Persia? Well, back at the time of Moses, when God led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and into the Promised Land, the land of Israel, God told them they could keep the land as long as they kept obeying him, but that if they disobeyed, he would remove them from the land. Centuries later, after repeated warnings through his prophets, God did remove them by sending Assyrian and then Babylonian armies to carry them away captive. That forced captivity ended decades later when the Persian Empire conquered Babylon and released the Jewish captives to return home to Jerusalem. But by then, generations of Jews had been born in the land of their captivity. Many of them enjoyed a fairly good standard of living and chose to remain there. So it was not surprising to find Mordecai the Jew living in the vicinity of the palace of Iran's ruler, Ahasuerus. And it was a series of events in the Iranian ruler's palace that eventually resulted in Mordecai the Jew becoming Iran's prime minister. As I mentioned a moment ago, those events included attempted murder and attempted genocide. The details of those events are found in the Old Testament book of Esther. So let's look at what happened. Now, in the days of Ahasuerus, that is, Ahasuerus who reigned from India even to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces, in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. But the queen, Vashti, refused to come at the king's commandment. Like other rulers in those days, King Ahasuerus had many wives and concubines, but only one of them enjoyed the status of queen. Vashti held that honored position, but her refusal to show up when the king called her to come to his party caused the king great embarrassment. His advisors suggested that he should remove Vashti from her position and select a new queen to replace her. Then the king's servants who served him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the beautiful young virgins to the citadel of Susa, to the women's house, to the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women. Let cosmetics be given them. Let the maiden who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." The thing pleased the king, and he did so. So the search for a new queen would reach practically worldwide, covering all 127 provinces of the empire. And it swept up in that process a beautiful young woman who had been brought up just outside the royal castle, the citadel of Susa. Her name was Esther, the Persian word for star, like a star in the sky. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah, the Hebrew word for the flowering myrtle plant. It's common even today for Jewish people to have a Hebrew name in addition to the name they have in the language of the nation where they live. Esther was an orphan and had been raised by her cousin Mordecai. There was a certain Jew in the citadel of Susa whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives, who had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. He brought up Hadassah, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The maiden was fair and beautiful, and when her father and mother were dead, Mordecai took her for his own daughter. Somehow, we're not told just how, but somehow the talent scouts recruiting candidates to be the next queen spotted Esther. So Esther was taken into the king's house, to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. That's where all the candidates for queen were taken. But the next step in the selection process, to choose the winner, did not involve a team of judges, as with modern TV talent shows or beauty contests. As shocking as it may be to us today, the selection process involved the contestants taking turns spending a night with the king. Each young woman's turn came to go in to King Ahasuerus. In the evening she went, and on the next day she returned into the second women's house, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who kept the concubines. She came in to the king no more, unless the king delighted in her, and she was called by name. Having slept with the king, the runners-up had to spend the rest of their lives confined to that concubine section of the royal palace. But as it turned out, Mordecai's cousin won the contest and was chosen to be the next queen. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she obtained favor and kindness in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Now, considering how nepotism in government often leads to the relatives of prominent people receiving appointment to jobs that they wouldn't otherwise be qualified for, we might assume that something like that led to Esther's cousin Mordecai being appointed prime minister. But that couldn't have happened here, because Esther kept secret the fact that she was Jewish, and that meant, of course, that she could not reveal that the man who was known as Mordecai the Jew was her cousin and her father by adoption. Esther had not yet made known her relatives nor her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai like she did when she was brought up by him. So how did Mordecai become prime minister? This is where the attempted murder and attempted genocide come into the picture. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, who were doorkeepers, were angry and sought to lay hands on the king, Ahasuerus. This thing became known to Mordecai, who informed Esther the queen, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. When this matter was investigated and it was found to be so, they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. But that didn't result in Mordecai's being rewarded with the prime minister's job. In fact, King Ahasuerus promptly forgot about Mordecai and didn't even thank him for saving the king's life from those would-be assassins. Instead, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. All the king's servants who were in the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai didn't bow down or pay him homage. So Haman was the one who got appointed as prime minister. We don't know much about Haman's background, except that he's called an Agagite, and that's a name historically connected with enemies of the Jewish people, a story for another time. In any case, Mordecai saw Haman as an enemy and refused to bow down to him. Haman knew that Mordecai was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai didn't bow down nor pay him homage, Haman was full of wrath. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even Mordecai's people. And that's where the attempted genocide comes in. Haman decided not only to kill Mordecai, but also to wipe out the Jewish people. Since the 127 provinces that Haman ruled over extended from Greece and North Africa in the west to India in the east, killing all the Jews in that wide territory would likely include all the Jews on earth. King Ahasuerus trusted his prime minister Haman when Haman proposed that genocide. Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, and their laws are different from other peoples. They don't keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to allow them to remain. If it pleases the king, let it be written that they be destroyed." Haman didn't name the Jews, and the king didn't bother to inquire which nationality Haman wanted to exterminate. He simply gave Haman the authority to carry out what he proposed. Then Haman gave orders for the genocide to be carried out. Letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even on the 13th day of the 12th month. After he saw that official proclamation, Mordecai told Esther that it would be up to her to intervene with the king to save the Jewish people. That was going to be tricky, however, because Persian law required the death penalty for anyone who approached the king without being called, and the king had not called for Esther in quite a while. So she feared for her life if she were to boldly walk into the king's presence and plead for the Jewish people. They told to Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai asked them return answer to Esther, "Don't think to yourself that you will escape in the king's house any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent now, then relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Who knows if you haven't come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" The book of Esther is unique among all the books of the Bible in that it never speaks directly about God. But it does show Mordecai and Esther as having faith in God's invisible hand of divine providence, faith that deliverance will come to the Jews, one way or another, and that it was not by accident that Esther was made queen, but rather that she was put into that influential position for such a time as this. Esther's response to Mordecai also shows that she and all the Jews in the royal city appealed to God before taking action. She told him, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. And I and my maidens will also fast the same way. Then I will go in to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Esther then prepared to hold dinners in her quarters on 2 successive days, with the king and Haman as the only guests, and she boldly appeared before the king to invite him, which he accepted. Haman boasted of his being invited to these private banquets with the king and queen, but he confided to his friends that nothing could make him happy so long as Mordecai refused to bow to him. Haman also said, "Yes, Esther the queen let no man come in with the king to the banquet that she had prepared but myself, and tomorrow I am also invited by her together with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Nothing could make Mordecai happy nothing could make Haman happy, rather, as long as Mordecai remained alive. And the planned genocide that would kill Mordecai and all the Jews was still weeks or months away. Then Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on it. Then go in merrily with the king to the banquet." This pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. God's miraculous intervention took place that night, intervention that turned out to be the first step in elevating Mordecai to replace Haman as prime minister. A sleepless night brought Mordecai back to the king's attention and reminded the king that he had never rewarded Mordecai for saving him from assassination. On that night, the king couldn't sleep. He commanded the book of records of the Chronicles to be brought, and they were read to the king. It was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs, who were doorkeepers, who had tried to lay hands on the king, Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor and dignity has been given to Mordecai for this?" Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." That was the turning point, changing Mordecai's fate from death by hanging to elevation to prominence. It was early morning by then, after the king's sleepless night. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had come into the outer court of the king's house to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servants said to him, "Behold, Haman stands in the court." The king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in. The king said to him, "What shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" This was also the turning point for Haman, who until this moment was bursting with joy at the prospect of finally killing Mordecai the Jew, and then banqueting privately with the king and queen. Now Haman said in his heart, "Who would the king delight to honor more than myself?" Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal clothing be brought, which the king uses to wear, and the horse that the king rides on, and on the head of which a royal crown is set. Let the clothing and the horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man with whom the king delights to honor with them, and have him ride on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Haman pictured himself about to be publicly honored in this way, so he suggested that it be glorious and pompous. But then, before Haman could open his mouth to ask permission to hang Mordecai on the gallows, the king spoke up with words that shattered Haman's hopes. Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry and take the clothing and the horse, as you have said, and do this for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that you have spoken." Instead of being honored before all the people, Haman was publicly shamed into being the one who had to publicly honor Mordecai. It had to be God's invisible hand of intervention that reversed the situation so dramatically. And God wasn't finished. There was still the matter of the genocide of the Jews that Haman had scheduled to be carried out in the weeks ahead. No sooner had Haman completed parading Mordecai before the people in the king's clothing on the king's horse than he was summoned to Esther's banquet. And there, in Haman's presence, she told the king that she, his beloved queen, was about to be killed, along with her relatives and all her people. Then King Ahasuerus said to Esther the queen, "Who is he and where is he who dared presume in his heart to do so?" Esther said, "An adversary and an enemy, even this wicked Haman." As the king's anger was then clearly against Haman, one of his officers standing by suggested, "Behold, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman has made for Mordecai, who spoke good for the king, is standing at Haman's house." The king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. King Ahasuerus then made Mordecai prime minister to replace Haman, and he gave Mordecai authority to stop and prevent the genocide of the Jews. Together with Esther the queen, Mordecai sent letters throughout the Persian Empire, authorizing the Jews, assisted by the king's men, to kill their enemies before their enemies could kill them. Mordecai and Esther also sent letters instructing the Jews everywhere to establish a new annual holiday called Purim to celebrate their victory from year to year. And Jews worldwide have continued for 2,500 years to celebrate that holiday of Purim at the same time each year, an annual reminder of the time when Iran had a Jewish prime minister. The concluding chapter of the book of Esther says, "King Xerxes imposed a tribute throughout his empire, even to the distant coastlands. His great achievements and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai the Jew became the prime minister, with authority next to that of King Xerxes himself. Hatred of the Jews, of course, has long since prompted Iran to delete from its history books any reference to Esther or to Mordecai the Jew. Just as God isn't actually named in the book of Esther, neither is Satan the devil, the evil one who was really behind Haman's attempt to exterminate the Jews. Just as Satan tried hundreds of years later to stop God's messianic prophecies from being fulfilled by having King Herod kill the baby boys of Bethlehem, Satan has tried more than once to wipe out the entire Jewish race to stop other Bible prophecy from coming true. Part of that prophecy, found throughout the Old and New Testaments, involves Christ returning to a Jewish Jerusalem. There was no Jewish Jerusalem for nearly 2,000 years after the Roman armies destroyed that city and dispersed the Jews as slaves who they sold throughout the Roman Empire. So before Jerusalem could be returned to Jewish hands in modern times, Satan the devil made another attempt to exterminate the Jewish people. During the Second World War, the Jews were being held captive and systematically killed in death camps for 3.5 years, from December 1941 through May 1945. The first camp, intended specifically to exterminate Jews rather than simply confine them, was the one at Chelmno, Poland, which began operations on December 8, 1941. The evil Nazi state operated those death camps for 3.5 years. That fits the prophecy of Daniel 7:25, which says, "This king will speak against the Most High God, and he will hurt and kill God's holy people. He will try to change times and laws that have already been set. The holy people that belong to God will be in that king's power for 3.5 years." In the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, Jesus speaks of a foretold great tribulation on the Jewish people, and Luke's parallel account includes the details that tribulation would consist of the Jews being led away captive into all the nations, and that Jerusalem would remain in Gentile hands until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. The Jews remained scattered among all the nations until their return to the Promised Land, with the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948, and they took control over Jerusalem during the Six-Day War in 1967. Writing in the late 1800s, Bible commentator Albert Barnes could not have known of these more recent events, but he said this about Matthew 24:21, where Jesus foretold a great tribulation. Verse 21, "There shall be great tribulation." The word tribulation means calamity or suffering. Luke 21:24 has specified in what this tribulation should consist. "They shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." That is, until the time allotted for the Gentiles to do it shall be fully accomplished, or as long as God is pleased to suffer them to do it. That's from Barnes' notes on Matthew 24:21. So the Great Tribulation on the Jews spanned the entire period of foreign dispersion, from the destruction of Jerusalem until modern Israel was founded and took back Jerusalem from Gentile hands. And that tribulation climaxed in the death camps that attempted to exterminate the Jewish race. If those days had not been cut short, as Jesus said, no Jewish flesh would have been saved. But God's intervention ended that Holocaust before it could achieve Satan's goal, the same goal Satan had in mind when he sent Haman to wipe out the Jews at the time of Esther and Mordecai. Instead of being totally exterminated by the Holocaust, millions of Jews have returned to the Promised Land in fulfillment of prophecy. And the Jews have taken back Jerusalem from the Gentiles who trampled it during that Great Tribulation. There is much more to the Bible's end times prophecies, well worth taking the time to read and study. For example, the 38th chapter of Ezekiel speaks about the role of Persia or Iran in the end times. Those familiar with Bible prophecy know that everything is falling into place. We eagerly share the good news about Jesus while there's still time. The stage is now set for Christ's return to a Jewish Jerusalem in fulfillment of the remaining prophecies. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus.
Pastor David Reed has authored numerous books, served as a contributing editor of Dr. Walter Martin's Christian Research Journal, taught at Spurgeon's in London, and pastored Emmanuel Baptist Church in New Bedford, Massachusetts. He now provides these worship services for individuals at home, and free to use by small groups and churches.
In addition to these live-streamed services, Bible Nook provides Bibles and books that you can download for free in digital form at BibleNook.com. Our videos of the worship services and individual messages are available for streaming at YouTube.com/BibleNook and also at Facebook.com/BibleNookMinistry. These live-streamed services are aimed at providing traditional worship services for believers who otherwise would not have them because they're confined to the home or because they don't have a nearby church that sings traditional hymns and preaches Bible messages. And these services are also aimed at reaching the world with messages proclaiming and upholding the gospel of Christ. We pay Facebook to boost our messages, and we pay Google to advertise our YouTube messages, with the result that the thought-provoking thumbnails have reached millions of people, and Facebook and YouTube report hundreds of thousands of views by people who watch and listen. For example, more than 80,000 views were reported for our message on the signs leading up to Christ's return, and about 85,000 views for our message, Don't Count on a Second Chance If You're Left Behind. Our other messages are reaching additional thousands each week. No one takes any salary from Bible Nook. All the gifts we receive go directly to spreading the gospel message. If the Lord moves your heart to spend some of your resources on this gospel outreach, you can do so by visiting BibleNook.com and clicking the donate button on the home page, or by sending a check to Bible Nook, 214 Onset Avenue, Suite 1464, Onset, Massachusetts, 02558.